In the spring of 1952, in the flat black soil country of northern Iowa, the whole township agreed on one thing before they agreed on anything else. A man could not run a corn farm on one leg. They said it at the feed store. They said it after church. They said it low and kind. The way people say a thing they believe is simply true and not unkind at all. George Ingram had heard it enough times by March that he had stopped raising his head when he heard the words coming. He was 26 years old, home 11 weeks from an army hospital in Denver, and the stump below his right knee still woke him at night with a pain that had no leg left to live in. His wife, Opal, could not read the papers that had come to the house while he was gone, and so she had signed what she was told to sign, believing the man who told her, because the man who told her wore a good coat and spoke the way bankers speak, slow and certain. By the time George came home on a bus with a cane and a duffel bag, 40 of his father's 55 acres belonged, on paper, to Roy Ashford, the largest landowner in the township, and George was left with 15 acres of the worst ground on the section, low and wet in the spring, hard and cracked by August, land his own father had once called the acres God forgot. The war had taken his leg in a ditch outside a village whose name he could not always remember to say the same way twice. 18 months of income had gone with the hospital bed, and now the land was gone too, all 3 losses stacked one on top of the other, like debts nobody had agreed he owed. The township did not call it theft. They called it unfortunate. They called it the kind of thing that happens to a family when the man of the house is away and the woman of the house cannot read. Roy Ashford called it, when he called it anything, a fair transaction properly witnessed, and he had a piece of paper with Opal Ingram's signature on it to prove it, a signature she did not remember making on words she never heard read aloud. George limped through that first spring on a cane and a wooden leg the army had given him, and he watched his neighbors watch him, waiting to see whether he would fight the paper or fold into it, and for a long while he did neither. He simply worked. He had come home believing 2 things the war had not managed to kill in him: that the ground still owed nothing to any man who did not work it honestly, and that a signature obtained in a hospital corridor 2,000 miles from the woman who signed it was not worth the ink it was written in, whatever the county clerk's stamp said about it. He did not yet know how he would prove that. He only knew that a man who had crawled the last 40 yards to a medic with his own blood freezing in the snow was not going to be finished off by a fountain pen. 15 acres of bad ground, 1 leg, a wife who could not read the very papers that had undone them, and a debt to a war that did not care what a corn farmer needed his body for. That was the whole of what he owned in the spring of 1952, and it was, though nobody in the township could have said so yet, exactly enough to start with. The confrontation everyone in Larchmont Township would talk about for the rest of that year happened on the 2nd Saturday of April, inside the Farmers' Co-op elevator office, where half the men in the county had gathered to settle their seed accounts before planting. George stood at the counter with Opal beside him, counting out crumpled bills for 80 pounds of open-pollinated corn seed, the cheapest kind the co-op sold, because the hybrid seed cost more than George had. Roy Ashford came in behind him, still in his church coat, a big soft man with a gold watch chain and the particular walk of someone who had never once had to worry about the price of anything, and he stopped at the counter and looked George over the way a man looks over a horse he's already decided not to buy. "Didn't expect to see you buying seed at all, George," Roy said, loud enough for the room. "Figured a man in your condition would have sold out and moved to town by now. Let somebody who can walk a row do the walking." A few men laughed, not cruelly, the nervous laugh of people who don't know where to look. Marlene Pratt, who ran the feed accounts, went very still behind her ledger. Thomas Voss, waiting his turn with a sack of oats on his shoulder, set the sack down slow, like a man clearing his hands for something. George did not raise his voice. He finished counting his bills onto the counter, and only then did he look at Roy, and he said that he had walked plenty of rows in Korea on worse ground than this, and that he expected he'd manage 40 acres of Iowa dirt just fine, whoever's name was presently written on the deed to it. He said the word presently the way a man sets down a tool he intends to pick back up. Roy's face changed for just a moment, something flickering behind the softness, and then he laughed it, off and turned to his own business. But the room had gone quiet, in a way that meant something had shifted. Marlene Pratt watched George count his change with a kind of open respect she did not try to hide. Outside, walking to the truck with Opal's hand under his arm, George said nothing at all, and that silence, more than anything he might have shouted, was the thing people in that elevator office remembered for years afterward. The young man with one leg who had not raised his voice, and the big man with two who had needed to raise his. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low to save coal oil, George told Opal he was not going to buy hybrid seed corn again, not that year and maybe not ever, because hybrid seed cost money he would need for the fight to come, and because the seed a man bought from a catalog could never be told to grow the way George needed corn to grow on land shaped exactly like his 15 worst acres. He had an idea he had turned over on the hospital cot in Denver during the long nights when sleep would not come, and the leg that was not there ached anyway. If a man selected his own best plants year after year, saved their seed, and refused every plant that did not meet his standard, he could build a strain of corn that belonged to no seed company and answered to nothing but his own 15 acres and his own 2 remaining working hands. Opal did not know much about corn breeding, but she knew what it meant that her husband was talking in whole sentences again, instead of the clipped, tired half-answers he had given all winter, and she told him to explain it to her from the beginning, the way she would have wanted the bank papers explained to her if anyone had bothered. George built his system that first summer the way a man builds anything when he has one leg and no money, slowly, and with tools reshaped to fit the body he actually had instead of the body he used to have. He walked his 15 acres with a cane in one hand and a ball of cotton string in the other, tying a loop around the stalk of every plant that showed him something worth keeping, a strong stand against the wind, an ear that filled out clean to the tip, a stalk that stayed green 2 weeks longer than its neighbors in the August heat. He kept a notebook Opal had bought him for a dime at the drugstore, and in it he recorded 5 things about every marked plant: height, ear placement, days to silk, resistance to the leaf blight that had taken a third of the township's crop the year before, and yield, guessed by hand until he could weigh it properly at harvest. 50 plants a season chosen out of thousands, and from those 50 he saved seed only from the best, discarding 4 out of every 5 lines that did not meet what he had written down in the notebook. He rigged a canvas bag over each selected ear before it silked, so no stray pollen from a lesser stalk could drift in and ruin the cross, and at the right hour each morning he walked the rows on his wooden leg and did the pollinating himself, tapping tassels into paper cones, carrying the pollen by hand to the ears he had chosen, sealing each one again after. It was slow work for a man with 2 good legs. For George it was slower still, and some mornings by the time he reached the far end of a row his stump was raw enough that he had to sit in the dirt between the corn and wait before he could stand again. He did not tell Opal how bad it got. He designed around it instead. He traded the labor of walking upright wherever he could for a horse named Duke and a converted single-row cultivator he built himself from salvaged parts, so that instead of stooping and bending down long rows the way a 2-legged farmer would, he rode where the ground allowed and built his beds higher than most men bothered to, so that the ears sat closer to a standing man's reach, and his stump never had to fold under him in the mud more than the work absolutely required. 6 years, he told Opal that first summer, though he did not fully believe the number himself when he said it out loud. 6 years and 12 generations of ruthless selection, keeping only the top 1/5 of what the land offered him each season, and he would own a strain of corn that belonged to nobody's catalog and nobody's price list, a strain that had been chosen, ear by ear, for exactly the 15 worst acres in Larchmont Township. Roy Ashford, riding past on the county road in his new Buick that summer, slowed once to watch George bent over the rows with his notebook, and did not understand what he was looking at, and did not think it worth understanding. A one-legged man walking his own corn with a piece of string and a dime store notebook looked, from a moving automobile, like exactly the kind of foolishness a beaten man clings to. Roy drove on. George kept walking the rows. The 5 criteria George settled on that first summer did not come to him all at once. He built them the way he built everything else that year, by trial, by failure, and by refusing to accept the first answer that presented itself. Height alone, he learned within the first 2 seasons, told him almost nothing useful, since a tall stalk on his low, wet corners often meant a plant reaching for light it could not properly use, wasting energy the ear needed instead. Ear placement mattered more, and he came to prize a low, snug ear that a man on a wooden leg could reach without stretching or stooping, since every motion he did not have to make twice across 55 rows was strength saved for the motion that came after it. Days to silk he tracked against his own hand-kept weather notes, because the seed catalogs assumed a growing season that bore no resemblance to the particular mix of late frost and early August heat his 15 acres actually endured. Blight resistance he learned to judge with his own eyes after the epidemic of 1952 taught the whole township a hard lesson about what happened to a field that had never once been asked to defend itself. And yield, the 5th criterion, he refused to estimate the way lazier men did, by eye and guesswork. He weighed it, ear by ear, on a small scale he had bought secondhand and bolted to a fence post, recording every number in the notebook, whether the number pleased him or not. Because a man who only wrote down his successes was not keeping a record, he was keeping a story he liked to tell himself. It was Duke, more than any single decision George made, who let the whole system function at the pace it needed to function. A neighbor had offered George the horse cheap in the fall of 1952, an animal too old for heavy plow work, but still strong enough for the lighter cultivation George's converted single-row rig required, and George trained himself to mount and dismount the cultivator seat in a single practiced motion that cost him, by the 3rd summer, no more time than it would have cost a man with 2 good legs to climb down and walk. He built the raised beds not for show, but out of simple arithmetic. Every inch he did not have to bend was an inch of pain his body did not have to spend, and a body with only so much pain to spend each day needed every inch it could save if it meant to make it all the way down every row before dark. The first real pressure from Roy Ashford's side came that October, delivered not by Roy himself, but by a lawyer from the county seat who drove out to the Ingram place in a car too clean for the road it had traveled, carrying a letter that used the word encroachment 3 times in 2 paragraphs. The letter claimed that a fence George's father had built decades before sat 11 feet onto what the letter called Mr. Ashford's rightful property, and it suggested, in the careful language lawyers use when they mean to threaten without quite threatening, that continued use of the disputed strip could be construed as trespass, with all the legal consequences trespass implied. George read the letter twice at the kitchen table while the lawyer waited by his car, and then he folded it once and put it in the drawer where he kept his discharge papers, and he told the lawyer to tell Mr. Ashford that the fence had stood where it stood since 1911 and would go on standing there, and that if Mr. Ashford wanted to test that in front of a judge, George would be glad to bring the original survey his father had kept folded inside a Bible for 40 years. The lawyer left without argument, but George understood the letter for what it was, not a real legal claim, but a message, the same message Roy had sent across the counter of the co-op elevator in April, delivered now in the shape of paper instead of laughter, because paper was the only language Roy Ashford fully trusted, the same language that had already taken 40 acres from a woman who could not read it. George did not sleep well that night. Opal found him at the table near midnight with the lamp still burning and the notebook open in front of him, not writing, just looking at the rows of numbers he had recorded that summer, as if the answer to a lawyer's letter might be hiding somewhere among the yield figures of 50 marked plants. She sat down across from him and said that her father used to say a man plants for the year he can see and the year he cannot, and that whatever Roy Ashford was building with his letters, George was building something too, something slower and quieter, and that slower and quieter had a way of outlasting loud when loud ran out of patience first. George did not answer her that night, but he blew out the lamp not long after, and in the morning he was back in the rows before the dew had lifted, walking the string-tied stalks the way he had all summer, saying nothing to anyone about the letter in the drawer. The years that followed tested a promise George had made to nobody but himself and his notebook. 1953 brought a dry summer that cracked the low fields into plates a man could lift with his fingers, and the 15 acres, being the worst ground on the section, suffered worse than any other field for 3 miles around. George's second-generation seed yielded barely enough to feed the family and Duke through the winter, with little left over to sell, and the debt at the co-op climbed past what Opal liked to see written down anywhere. 1954 was little better. A wet spring that drowned the low corners and delayed planting passed the date George had marked as his cutoff, so that his selected lines went into ground already behind schedule. He kept his notebook anyway. He kept his string and his canvas bags and his ruthless discarding of 4 plants out of 5, even in years when discarding 4 out of 5 felt like discarding food from his own children's mouths, because Opal was carrying their first child by then, and every bushel mattered in a way it had not mattered when it was only the 2 of them. Wendell Doss, who farmed the section next to George's, and had known him since they were boys stealing watermelons together before the war, came by more than once that hard stretch. With a sack of feed corn he pretended he had extra of, and George took it without much argument, because a man too proud to accept help from Wendell Doss was a man too proud to feed his own family, and George had buried that particular kind of pride somewhere in a hospital in Denver along with his leg. What George would not accept was advice to quit the breeding project and simply buy hybrid seed like every sensible farmer for 3 counties around. He heard that advice often in those years, delivered kindly by Wendell and unkindly by others, and each time he gave the same answer: that hybrid seed cost money he did not have, and that the 15 acres he had left were going to have to learn to feed his family on their own terms or not at all, because he did not intend to spend the rest of his life renting his own ambitions from a seed company in Illinois. By 1955, the whispering in the township had taken on a settled, almost affectionate shape. The way people talk about a local eccentric, they have decided, is harmless. They called him the seed man behind his back, not unkindly exactly, but not as a compliment either, a man who walked his rows with string and a notebook, instead of doing what any sensible farmer did, which was drive to the co-op each spring and buy what the seed companies had spent real money developing. At the Grange Hall supper that October, a man named Curtis Hale, who farmed 300 acres 2 miles east and had never lost a crop to anything worse than a late frost, stood up during the social hour and said, loud enough for half the room, that he'd heard George Ingram was still out there, hand-pollinating corn with paper bags like it was 1890, and asked whether the war had maybe left more damage than just the leg. It got the laugh Curtis wanted. Marlene Pratt, sitting near the coffee urn, did not laugh, and said within earshot of several people that she had seen George's yield receipts at the co-op scale the past 2 autumns, and that whatever he was doing out there with his string, his numbers were closing the gap on Curtis Hale's hybrid corn faster than Curtis seemed to know. Nobody paid her much mind that night. George himself was not at the supper to hear any of it. He was home, as he was most evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, entering that season's numbers into the notebook, 5 columns per plant, comparing them against 4 years of numbers that came before, watching a pattern begin to hold that no one else in the township had bothered to look for, because no one else had bothered to keep the books. What nobody in Larchmont Township could see, because it did not announce itself in any way a passing car on the county road could measure, was the thing happening underground in George's 15 acres between 1955 and 1957. Not underground in the soil exactly, though the roots were part of it, but underground in the sense of invisible, cumulative, the kind of change that does not show itself until it has already become too large to stop. Each generation of selection tightened the strain a little further toward what George's specific ground demanded, a shorter, sturdier stalk that would not lodge in the wind that came unbroken across the flat, low fields. An ear set a little higher to keep it clear of the wet spring mud. A root system, though George could not see it, that reached deeper for water than any catalog hybrid bred for richer ground 3 counties over had ever needed to reach. By the 6th generation, the difference had become visible in the field itself, if a man cared to walk it and look, which almost nobody did. George's corn stood a shade darker green through the driest weeks of August than Curtis Hale's or Roy Ashford's tenant-farmed rows, and it stood straighter after a wind that flattened patches of hybrid corn 2 farms over. George said nothing about this to anyone but Opal and Wendell. He had learned across those 5 hard years that a quiet advantage was worth more than a loud one, that a man who let his neighbors underestimate him kept a card in his hand that a man who bragged had already thrown away, and that Roy Ashford, watching from a moving car, had never once bothered to slow down and actually look. Roy Ashford's overconfidence, when it finally showed itself in the fall of 1957, took the form of a speech he had no need to give. At the county fair that September, standing at the edge of the exhibition tent where the co-op posted the season's yield averages by township, Roy told a small crowd of men, with the easy volume of someone who has never once doubted his own standing, that he intended to buy up whatever land came available in Larchmont Township over the next few years, starting, he said, with a smile aimed loosely in the direction of anyone who might carry the words back to George, with the 15 sorry acres presently wasted on a man too stubborn to farm sensibly. He said it as a joke among friends. It did not stay among friends. Thomas Voss, standing nearby with his youngest boy, repeated it word for word to Wendell Doss within the hour, and Wendell told George that same evening, watching his friend's face for a reaction that did not come. What Roy did not know, because he had never once walked George's rows to check, was that the co-op's own posted averages that September showed George Ingram's 15 acres yielding, higher per bushel than Roy Ashford's own tenant-farmed ground, for the first time in 5 years, a fact sitting in plain sight on a chalkboard 40 feet from where Roy had made his boast. Emboldened by a confidence the numbers did not support, Roy did something that fall he had not risked doing before. He had his lawyer file papers with the county to formally consolidate the disputed 40 acres into a single recorded deed under his own name alone, closing what had until then been left as an informal arrangement, resting on Opal's uncertain signature, apparently believing that 4 years of silence from the Ingrams meant the matter was settled and safe to make permanent. It was, though Roy could not have known it yet, the single worst mistake of his life, because a deed recorded in haste, to close a matter its own author feared might still be questioned, leaves behind exactly the kind of paper trail an honest lawyer can later use to prove that a man was covering something rather than simply confirming it. The institutional attack came that winter, and it came from the direction George had least expected, though he should have expected it, since Roy Ashford sat on the loan committee of the same county bank that held the mortgage George had been forced to take out during the drought years to keep Duke fed and the family clothed. In January of 1958, George received a letter from the bank calling the full balance of his loan due within 90 days, citing a technical default buried in language about seasonal payment timing that no other farmer in the township had ever been held to so strictly. Wendell Doss, whose own loan sat at the same bank with the same clause unenforced for a decade, told George plainly that this was Roy's hand moving a piece he did not need to touch directly to move it, using the leverage of a bank seat, the way he had once used the leverage of a lawyer's letter. 90 days was not enough time to raise the balance from 15 acres in the dead of an Iowa winter, and everyone who heard about the letter in the following weeks, and in a township that size everyone heard, believed George Ingram had finally run out of road. Curtis Hale said as much at the feed store, not unkindly this time, but with a kind of resigned sympathy, that a man could only fight bad luck and a banker for so long before the two of them together simply wore him down. Opal, 7 months along with their second child, sat at the kitchen table the night the letter arrived and, for the first time in 6 years, asked George directly whether it was time to give up the breeding project, sell what corn they had, and take whatever the bank would leave them, rather than lose everything on paper the way they had once lost the 40 acres. George held the letter in his hand a long time before he answered her. He told her that he had spent 6 winters and buried a hospital bed's worth of pain to make it those 6 winters, teaching 15 acres to feed his family, on nothing but his own judgment, and that he was not going to hand that judgment over to a man who had never once walked the rows to see what it had built. He did not know, sitting at that table in January of 1958, exactly how he would answer the bank's letter. He knew only that he would not answer it by quitting. The darkest stretch of that winter asked more of George than any single season had asked since the hospital in Denver. He held the line the only way he knew how, in silence, the same silence he had used across the co-op counter in 1952 and had never once abandoned since. He drove to the county seat and found a young lawyer, a war veteran himself named Harold Beck, who had set up practice 2 years before and had not yet built a client list large enough to owe anyone in the township a favor, and George laid the bank letter, the fence letter, and the original 1911 survey his father had kept folded in, the family Bible on the man's desk, and asked him to look into every piece of paper Roy Ashford's name had ever been attached to concerning the Ingram land. It cost George money he barely had. He sold 2 of his young hogs to pay the retainer. Work he did alone on the coldest morning of that January, with his stump aching in the cold the way it always did in winter, a pain he had stopped mentioning to Opal years before, because mentioning it changed nothing and worried her more than it helped. Wendell Doss came by twice that month, once with a sack of feed George did not ask for, and once simply to sit at the kitchen table and say nothing, which George understood was its own kind of help. On paper that winter, George Ingram had nothing: a foreclosure notice with a 90-day clock running, 40 acres recorded in another man's name, a wife close to delivering their second child, and 15 acres of frozen ground that could not be sold for enough to satisfy the bank's demand even if he had wanted to sell it. What he had that did not show up on any paper was 6 years of a notebook, a strain of corn that had proven itself on the co-op's own chalkboard, and a hunch sharpened by Harold Beck's early digging that Roy Ashford's rushed decision to formally record the disputed 40 acres the previous fall had been filed with a description of the property boundary that did not match, in 3 separate places, the original 1911 survey folded in the Ingram family Bible. The reversal came on a March morning in 1958, and it came exactly the way George had told Opal it would, years before she fully believed him, not because George fought Roy Ashford, but because Roy's own haste finally caught up with itself. Harold Beck's research turned up what a careful lawyer, working without the pressure of a boast to make good on, would never have missed. The deed Roy had rushed to record the previous October, in his eagerness to close a matter he feared might still be questioned, described the 40 disputed acres using boundary markers copied from a neighboring parcel's paperwork rather than the Ingram land's own 1911 survey, an error that rendered the entire recorded transfer legally void on its face, not merely disputable but void, the instant anyone thought to check it against the original survey. Roy Ashford, so certain that 4 years of Ingram's silence meant the matter was settled forever, had never once had the boundary resurveyed before filing, confident enough in his own standing that due diligence had felt to him like an insult beneath his attention. Harold Beck filed the challenge at the county courthouse on the 11th of March, the same building where, 6 years before, a fraudulent signature obtained from an illiterate woman in her husband's absence had first quietly become official. This time the hearing was public, and this time the county judge, reading the 1911 survey against Roy's rushed 1957 filing in front of a courtroom that included Marlene Pratt, Thomas Voss, Wendell Doss, and Curtis Hale, all of whom had come to watch once word spread through the township that the seedman's lawyer had found something real, ruled the 1957 deed void and ordered the original 40 acres restored to the Ingram name, the same 40 acres that had been taken from a woman who could not read the words that took them. Roy Ashford did not speak during the ruling. He sat at the respondent's table in his good coat, and for the first time in 6 years the township watched him wear the stillness George had worn at the co-op counter in 1952, the stillness of a man with nothing left to say that would help him. He did not fight the ruling further. There was, Harold Beck told George afterward, nothing left in the paperwork for him to fight it with. The years that followed the courtroom ruling turned what had been a private string and notebook project into something the whole county eventually came to understand, though it took time, the way real change on a farm always takes longer to notice than it takes to happen. With the 40 acres restored, George had 55 acres to plant with a strain of corn that had spent 6 generations learning to thrive on the worst 15 of them, and on the better ground it flourished further still. By 1960, the 8th year since he had come home on a bus with a cane and a duffel bag, George's self-bred corn was posting yields the co-op recorded at 118 bushels an acre against a township average for commercial hybrid seed of 96, and his cost of seed for that planting, since he saved and selected his own from the prior harvest exactly as he had every year since 1952, stood at nothing at all, not $1, against the 350. A bag his neighbors were by then paying for hybrid seed, whose price had climbed further nearly every season since he'd started. It was that same year, with the bank loan long since paid off from the sale of his surplus seed corn to 2 neighboring farmers who had finally stopped calling him the seed man and started asking him for planting advice, that George Ingram had, for the first time since 1952, enough saved to hire Harold Beck for one more piece of work, formally establishing, through a small seed cooperative George set up with Wendell Doss and 2 other veterans farming nearby, a legal record of his strain's origin and lineage, so that no rushed deed and no careless boast could ever again quietly take from his family something built with this much patience. Roy Ashford, meanwhile, sold off most of his remaining land within 3 years of the courtroom ruling, his standing in the township having thinned considerably once the story of the void deed became something people repeated at the Grange Hall, the way they had once repeated his joke about the seedman's stubbornness. And he left the county altogether, before the decade was out, a departure the township noted without much ceremony, the way people note the ending of a story they had already stopped being interested in. Through all of it, one object never left George's hands, a plain wooden seed scoop, worn smooth at the handle, that his father had used before him and that George had carried into the fields on the very first morning of the very first summer, tying his first loop of cotton string around a stalk with that same scoop tucked into his coat pocket. It had been in his hand at the co-op counter the day Roy Ashford mocked him in front of the township. It had ridden in his coat through every hard winter of hand pollination and every discarded 4/5 of a season's careful selection. It had sat on the kitchen table the night the foreclosure letter arrived, and Opal had noticed, without either of them remarking on it, that George's hand had rested on it while he told her he would not quit. Roy Ashford, in all his years of watching George from a moving car and a bank committee seat, had never once touched it, never once known it existed, because a man like Roy did not look closely enough at anything to notice a scoop worn smooth by a stranger's thumb. By 1960, that same scoop sat on a shelf in the Ingram farmhouse, not retired, still used every autumn to measure seed corn into cooperative members' sacks, but changed in what it meant to the people who saw it there. It had once been the humble, ordinary tool of a man everyone in the township believed was finished before he had properly begun. It had become, without ever changing shape, the plainest possible proof that patience recorded honestly, generation after generation in a dime store notebook, could outlast both a stolen signature and a rush deed, and that a man could lose a leg, lose 40 acres, and lose 18 months of his working life, all in the same terrible year, and still, given enough seasons and enough stubbornness, grow every bit of it back from the ground up.